Well, thank you for having me here today. It's a real privilege to be invited by Nuffield Australia over from New Zealand to come and present to you. So I'm really grateful to be here, so thanks Jim for inviting us over. As you heard, my name's Sophie Stanley. I'm a 2013 Nuffield Scholar from New Zealand, and I looked at how we can use social media more effectively in the agricultural industry. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I'm going to repeat a quote actually Trent mentioned earlier. It's not the strongest that survive, nor the most intelligent, but it's the ones most adaptive to change. And I think that's a theme we'll hear a lot over the next few days about adapting to change in our industry, because I think it's a really important concept. Because our world is ever changing and ever evolving, and over the years the agricultural industry has been at the forefront of those changes. So when we hear the word social media, why is it that everyone gets a little bit scared and shudders a little bit? Is it because your teenage kids spend too much time on it and they waste a lot of time on it? Or is it for other reasons? So I think it's important to get context on how we can use this for business purposes. So, brief overview, you probably don't need an explanation, but social media is user-generated content for the purpose of two-way communication, so you can engage with people. So that's the likes of Facebook, Twitter, blogging, YouTube. They're your usual suspects in this space. And the interesting thing about it is it's only about 10 years old, which isn't very long when you think about a really mainstream form of communication nowadays. And in fact, by the time it actually became popular in New Zealand and probably Australia as well, it was only probably about 5 years ago that people actively were using it. When I was at university, we had no form of social media, so it's a really interesting change. But before I want to move forward, the title of my presentation up there is social media, but I think because things change so quickly, in 10 years this might not be even relevant. Things might have moved on even further. So I want to talk really about what's my vision and our vision for the future of communication in the agricultural industry, and what are the things that we need to consider when we look at these things. So we all know the stats around the world population. There's 7 billion people in the world right now, growing to about 9 billion people by the year 2050. But what we know from users in the world, there's 1.5 billion users of social media in the world. And I can absolutely guarantee you those 1.5 billion people also eat food, which is our prime market. So there's not many other industries that could guarantee you that you have a market right there ready to engage with you. So, the interesting thing is here, you might not care about this platform, social media, you might not have any interest in using it, but the fact of the matter is the people eating our produce do, and they are using it to share their ideas and thoughts about food production. And they might be saying things that are right, they might be saying things that are totally wrong and misinformed, and if we're not there to participate in that conversation, things might change quite a bit. What's happening out there? People using Instagram to take pictures of food. It's a very popular movement to show people what you're eating these days. There's so many cooking shows on TV these days with master chefs, My Kitchen Rules. I swear every time I turn on the television there's another cooking show. So people are really passionate about food. And they also have an opinion on it. When I was travelling around the world, I stayed in a lot of hostels as I travelled just to save a bit of money. And a lot of the conversation I had in the hostels was about organic food and how food's produced. As soon as they heard that I was involved in the farming industry, that's what they wanted to talk about. Paleo diets, gluten-free, there's so many fads out there that now people are talking about that we need to be aware of. And that's because food's emotional and it's personal. And the reason why is it affects ourselves and our families and our health. So we can understand why people are so connected to the way food, and they want to talk about it and they want to share their opinions on it. So I looked at 4 different things in my Nuffield journey, and the first 2 was looking at social media, how we can use it for a networking tool in our industry and also as an extension tool in our industry. But I'm not going to cover those off today due to lack of time. So I'm going to focus today on how we can use it in consumer engagement and crisis communication. I had really 3 basic observations as I travelled the world, and not just in the Western world. Smartphone ownership is dramatically increasing all around the world, and it's it's very interesting. Even as we travelled through India on the Global Focus Tour, you'd see people who didn't have any housing to speak of or any clothes, but they had a cell phone in their hand. So it's very interesting to see that this is the way the trends are going around the world, and particularly in some of our growing markets like China, smartphone ownership is absolutely massive. So people are connected at all times. In New Zealand, Dairy NZ did a study recently, and 64% of dairy farmers in New Zealand now have a smartphone, and they use that in their business, which is massive. And farmers are the biggest uptake of smartphone ownership in New Zealand, which is a really interesting statistic. And a lot of people say, well, farmers aren't involved in this, and actually when you look at the stats, they are. But the interesting thing here is, look, the vision I think we need to have for communication in our industry, and it follows on from some of the things we've heard earlier today, that, you know, I've got three ideas. We need to think globally about communication. If we don't think globally, you know, our markets are now global, it's not just domestic. Secondly, we need to be really authentic and transparent in our communication methods, because if we don't create trust with our consumers. And thirdly, we need to be collaborative, and we need to work together, because one voice can get lost in the masses. So to demonstrate those sort of three visions I have for communication, I'm going to tell you three stories from my trip, hopefully to demonstrate what I'm talking about. And the first one's about a company in the States called Chipotle, and Chipotle is a Mexican fast food restaurant, and they promote the use of sustainable and ethically raised produce in their restaurants, and their tagline is cultivate a better world. Interestingly enough, they also have a very, very big, large marketing budget, which allows them to produce some pretty phenomenal campaigns. So due to time constraints, I can't show you the videos because they're quite long, but if you do have time later, I recommend you, if you haven't seen them already, Google on YouTube their video, The Scarecrow, which I'm going to talk to you about today, or their recent series called Farmed and Dangerous, that probably doesn't need too much explanation. But the Scarecrow video was only on YouTube, so they didn't put it on television. It was only available on YouTube. And it was a story of a company called Crow Foods Incorporated. And what they did is they pumped chickens full of horrible green goo and antibiotics. They also housed all their cows in cages and big black barns. And the produce that they produced was 100% beef-ish. So this video was seen by about 13 million people online on YouTube, and then was spread virally via social media around the world. Their stance against factory farming paints a pretty ugly picture for agriculture, but is it true? You know, does it matter? An article I read in the New Yorker when I was in New York asked the question, is it a genuine commitment to sustainability, or is this just a cynical attempt to turn fears into sales? And I guess my question is, does it matter because it's working? People are watching it. And the Centre of Food Integrity research stated that only about 2% of Americans are on farms, and 72% of Americans have no knowledge of farming whatsoever. So you can read from the comment streams on YouTube that people actually believe this is what is happening. And not only that, is because our food is now exported globally, is that what they think we do in our countries as well? We've got to think about that context in terms of that. So my point here is we are a global market, and whilst we aren't in the US and this company may not be in our country, people are seeing these stories globally, and our consumers are global now. Secondly, people get caught up in the emotion of these stories. This is a very emotional story. People don't like seeing the way their food's produced like this, and it's not true in all cases, in most cases. But these stories create emotional reactions with people, and we've got to be aware of that. So we have to be authentic and transparent and tell stories of our own. And also we have to be collaborative, because if we try and defend these things by one person, it's not going to get very far. So we need an industry effort, a group of people to help support these messages. The second story I want to tell you is a little closer to home here in Australia, and I don't probably need to go too much into it because you're probably all aware of it. So I guess the summary is Four Corners Television documentary ran a pretty visual documentary on some animal cruelty and live export industry to Indonesia. Whilst it wasn't happening within the Australian industry, what the uproar that happened after it was very much domestically, and a lot of Australian people and consumers were very concerned about it. But the issue here is a lot of this talk happened on social media, and there wasn't many farmers that were active in this space to be involved in the conversation and have their perspective taken account of. And I talked to some farmers in the Northern Territory, and they said this situation really led them to get involved in the social media movement because they knew their voice wasn't being heard. So I guess my point here is proactivity is really important in social media, because if we don't have our voice out there already, why are people going to trust us when we say anything? So we need to build relationships with our consumers early. Otherwise, when situations like this happen, people aren't going to listen to our industry. They're just going to think we're jumping in to defend it. So we need to build those relationships early before any further issues may happen in the future. And we have to be authentic and transparent, because why should someone believe the farming industry over the very clever marketing campaigns that other activist organisations have? My third story is about a company in New Zealand, which hopefully all of you are aware of, Fonterra. So Fonterra is one of our biggest organisations. Most of the dairy farmers in New Zealand supply Fonterra. And whilst I was travelling on my Nuffield last year, I was over in the UK, and a crisis broke where they thought that there was potentially some botulism, which is a bacteria, in some of the milk products they were exporting overseas. And a lot of our produce goes over to China and Asia, and we heard earlier again today that food safety is such a big issue in China, and whenever they get a little bit of a scare about something happening, they go pretty cold quite fast. So when this was released, when this scare happened, there was no social media team involved in Fonterra, and they're one of the biggest companies in New Zealand, which was quite surprising. And so, I think one of the biggest lessons here learned, I went on there was about 10,000 messages on the Sina Weibo, which is the Chinese social media forum. They have 536 million users in China, and there was about 10,000 messages in the hours after the crisis broke about this situation that no one could respond to because they weren't active in that space. So for big food companies, I think it's more and more important that we have a voice on social media, because food safety is such a critical issue, and if we don't engage with people in a very quick time frame, then stories get made up about us. So that's why it's really important, and we have to think globally. It's not just our Western countries that we deal with now. We need to think about what does social media look like in the Chinese environment or another country's environment as well. So I guess my conclusion is when we're looking at our communication strategies, social media being one of them, we need to think globally. We need to have a really authentic and transparent voice, but we need to work together, because if we don't work together, our voice will get lost in the masses. And most people don't change because they see the light, they change because they feel the heat. And we want to avoid that, and I think being proactive in the industry and getting out there and sharing our voice is really important. And I think as Nuffield scholars and industry leaders in this room, we're considered thought leaders in the industry, and we really need to take, the first step in this space so we can lead the industry forward. So thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate being here, and thank you to our New Zealand sponsors who helped me on our journey overseas. So thank you.